So I'm just back from a festival in the north of New Zealand called Lakeside Odyssey, and I just sort of give a quick update on my experiences there and kind of features of the hands that I encountered in this particular festival. It's actually notable looking at the hands that I did look at and looking at the list of what features that were present there, that there were actually many people who had radial loop fingerprint patterns on the index finger. And that was a really common theme that I needed to discuss over the course of the weekend. And secondly, there were a large number of people who had double loops on their fingers or thumbs. So that's kind of interesting to me that we're getting those kind of combination of patterns in that kind of environment. People with radial loops, of course, are very group orientated and very easy to manipulate within group environments. They adapt completely easily to social circumstances because they want to fit in. And they're very good at taking on board the attitudes and values of any particular kind of group. And I think that's significant in a festival environment where, for example, particularly there is a lot of cult influences. There were quite a few cult operators moving around the festival, clearly trying to recruit people into their cults. And people with radial loops are kind of very susceptible to that kind of undue influence, I think, because their radial loop pattern often gives a kind of people-pleasing or an amenability thing. I mean, they're strongly empathic. If you have a radial loop, you're a strongly empathic person. You take on board a lot from other people. So the radial loop is perhaps not surprising to see in that kind of environment, and potentially quite problematic for some of the people who had that particular pattern. Most of the time, I think people with radial loop are kind of searching for a sense of personal identity, trying to find the right fit, trying to find the right people that they can feel comfortable around. People with radial loops also don't like criticism. So it's another kind of characteristic of this sort of the spiritual mishmash that you tend to get in these kind of festival environments, is kind of like don't be judgy, acceptance, and so on and so forth, because people with radial loops are incredibly sensitive to criticism because they're hyper responsive to other people's expectations of them. So in some ways that's that's to be expected, and not particularly surprising that I would see more radial loops in that kind of environment than I would expect to see. But probably more interest is the double loop. So there were quite a number of people with double loops on their thumbs. Actually, the men tended to have double loops on their thumbs. Oh no, that's not, sorry, I beg your pardon. That's actually split quite even. There were 2 men with double loops on their thumbs and 2 men with double loops on their index fingers. And I'd expect to see double loops on the thumbs, the double loop fingerprint pattern being indicative of kind of an indecisiveness, vacillation, having difficulty making up one's mind, difficulty choosing a course of action, because the thumb is the application of the energetics to the world, and with a double loop there's like the seeing of both sides and the weighing up of 2 options, and the difficulty therefore implementing a particular course of action because the grass is always greener on the other side. But when you see the double loop on the index finger, I think that's far more telling. And I've got a print example here. I'll just show you that because the double loop on the index finger is. Let me just focus that for you, so you can see there it is. It's on the index finger. The double loop creates what you can call a confusion in your sense of personal identity. So the vacillation or the oscillation between the 2 poles of the loop is much more profound in the case of people with a double loop on their index finger, because it affects their sense of self-confidence, it affects the sense of who they are and what they're doing with their lives. So it's a kind of much more fundamentally, psychologically impactful pattern because it affects their self-belief and their self-confidence. What people with double loops on their index finger tend to experience is a great sense of self-doubt, and this is the case in both these men that I spoke with. That they're often doubting themselves. They kind of feel inspired to go on a particular course of action, then they kind of undermine themselves by second-guessing themselves all the time. And another kind of function of that is the kind of once that kind of that questing that goes with that is a kind of like a fuels a question for like identifying who their own identity and who they are, because it feels like their identity is on shifting sands. It's constantly revolving or moving around. I often give the analogy of like being caught in a rip tide. So you've got the sea pushing in one way and the undertow pulling you out the other way. You get these two contradictory impulses. One's going forward, one's going back, and it can create a kind of locking or confusion for the person. And the lock-in, the confusion can create a desire to kind of transcend the duality of ordinary existence, and therefore be inclined to take transcendentalist paths of spirituality, which is essentially escapism. Because fundamentally, our experience of life is in fact dualized. We can't have day without night, we can't have up without down, we can't have in without out, black without white, and so on and so forth. The duality of existence is a fundamental descriptor of the polarities that move within existence itself: contraction and expansion, movement towards, movement away, propulsion, repulsion. And this trick is to accept that is the fundamental pattern of life, and once that can be done, then there can be an integration of those two polarities. But when there's an immaturity, kind of soul immaturity and the psychological immaturity for dealing with that, the easy solution seems to be to say, well, let's just want to get out of this duality altogether. Let's go into some kind of transcendental realm where we are beyond the realm of duality. And so it's very easy for these people to get caught up in ideologies that sell a kind of spiritual transcendentalism, which is effectively just a form of kind of spiritual dissociation. So the double loop on the index finger is incredibly confusing for people. They often say they identify themselves as being more spiritual people. And then that's certainly true for these two men that I'm referring to in my experience this weekend. But the question is, are they? Because spirituality isn't about escaping. Anyway, these are my thoughts on the major things that I've seen on the weekend. Fingerprint patterns are incredibly important. Lots to learn there.